Christopher, thank you so much for making time to talk with me today and for reaching out. It's so wonderful to be able to speak with a medical historian during this time. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Do you want to introduce yourself and tell people a little bit more about the work you do before we get started?
Okay, well, I call myself a professional medical public health historian of practice. I did my Ph.D. at University of Toronto with Michael Bliss, historian to the discovery of insulin. My Ph.D. was on the history of polio in the early mid-90s. And that led me to a lot of different things that I do now with history of polio itself, with epidemics, and history of vaccines and immunization. My thesis involved the history of Connaught Laboratories, which was part of the University of Toronto from 1914 to 72. And my thesis got me into their archives, and which was very significant to that project. And then I've since done a lot of work as a consultant for Connaught today, which is Sanofi Pasteur in Canada, so it carries on. And they have a very rich history. So I'm a resident historian there. And so for the last 25 years or so, doing research, managing the archives, writing, consulting, exhibits. They've been a great place, very respectful of history. I'm not a PR person so much. I have access to the archives and primary documents and work with them and share a lot of that material. I've done a lot of articles and exhibits and things. And I'm working with Neil Orford currently on the Insulin 2021 or Insulin 100th Anniversary Defining Moments Canada project, which is how I actually found about you. Your interview with him introduced me to what you're doing, and so I'm working a lot on that, and that work is actually kind of fits in with a lot of this the pedagogy idea and applying it in interesting ways. So that's sort of where I'm coming from, I guess.
And Neil's, the Defining Moments Canada organization, I feel like because of this moment has been able to highlight the importance of understanding so many defining moments, but like medical public health defining moments because of their first work on the Spanish flu. So I am extra excited to see what comes of the insulin project. The first question that I ask, which to me seems like a good segue into asking if you have thought of history any different because of this moment. I have a cat here, I also just want to say, who's been whining all through your answer.
My dog can pop in too, by the way.
Yeah. It'll be just a pet menagerie. If you've thought of history any different during the pandemic, and if that is like impacting some of the conversations around the insulin project. That's like a double question, but you can answer whichever part you'd like.
Well, as I've been saying a lot through this pandemic, it's been surreal as an historian of epidemics, of pandemics, as a sort of specialty, as opposed to just a general historian or medical historian in general that may specialize in all kinds of different things, but to actually be specialized in infectious diseases in Canada. Not way back in the medieval times or Renaissance, but actually in the 20th century focused. In the most recent time, we had an epidemic with polio, particularly, or SARS. I've done projects on that and lived through it myself. So it's been surreal in the sense of normally I understand or know how the story ends or how the epidemic ended and what it meant and what its impact was. But right now, we're in the middle of it, and it's not quite clear how it's going to end, when and how, and what's going to happen because of it, and what impact it's going to have. And we're in a global pandemic. It's not like polio. It was specific acute epidemic situations that were localized for the most part, although it was carried on for many decades. But nothing quite like this really has happened for 100 years or so since the Spanish flu on a global scale. So there's a lot of stuff happening, and to be in the middle of it and watching all the different elements beyond just the medical stuff, but politics and the economics and the differences between countries, but difference within countries. Watching the Americans manage this pandemic. We're bad enough, regardless of who was president, but to have someone like Trump, a major wild card, really, changing the whole situation in a unique way, and comparing that with us in Canada, how that differs and how different provinces differ and different states. different countries around the world. So there's a lot going on around us to be able to relate to past experiences, but also recognize differences, because it's being in the middle of something, you need time to actually to be able to look back at something as a historian. So there's always that, to be careful not to apply history too early in the middle of something, because when you're doing history of something in the past, you have time to be able to assess things. And
so I'm thinking about what you said, like we are in a particular moment right now, and like you are used to knowing how it ends, and then you, as a historian, you develop your interpretation around those things that are already kind of in place. So have you like rethought of some of your interpretations or some of the evidence that you have looked at in various history projects, because you're like, oh, this is something different that might have been happening during a pandemic or a public health issue that I hadn't considered before?
The idea of just sort of living through an experience like this, you have a better sense of, on a personal level, apart from being a historian, but as a personal experience, to seeing what's going on around you and appreciating just the anxiety, the uncertainty. That, it's easy to look back at a polio epidemics and know a vaccine was coming. There was an end to it. It went on for a long time, and there's all kinds of stuff about that. But just knowing at that time, we didn't know that. And especially with polio, there's kids involved, and it's a whole different kind of mindset. We have similar things with COVID, but it's different. There's a different kind of feel to it. But still, that sense of uncertainty. And if I'm going back literally to actually revising my manuscript and updating it and helping me rethink what to emphasize, and also, there was a lot of mentions of my manuscript. Some of the comments were to de-emphasize the epidemics, because I was going through different provinces and different major epidemics and responses and political elements and things like that. And maybe I was doing it too much, perhaps. And there was an emphasis to maybe cut them back a lot and focus more on the vaccine stuff, because that's a big part of what I do, and no one's really complaining about that. But there's a real importance between the two. The epidemics, especially in the Canadian context, and the relationship with the vaccine, and the political, not labs and all that kind of stuff. So that if we hadn't been going through an epidemic or a pandemic today, maybe I wouldn't have emphasis, wanted to go back to it at all, or in a different way, or thinking more, maybe I will just cut that stuff out and and focus on the vaccine story, which, as I said, people have been happy with that, and it hasn't really been a problem.
That makes me think of, that makes me think of Ian Duncan, who's a teacher that I did one of the conversations with, when he said, I don't think history has changed, but our views and perspectives have. And of course, I think what he really means is like the past hasn't changed, but our views and perspectives have, because then that helps us like develop these histories. And so like that's one of the things that really struck me in this moment about the interpretations that we, especially in like K-12 classrooms, are so used to, like they won't work in this moment where are these new things. So I know K-12 teaching is not your your area of specialty, but of course there's a lot of different ways we can think of mobilizing the past, which is how I understand the teaching of history. So do you think the teaching of history, do you think the ways that we will mobilize the past, do you think the ways that we will teach history will change after this moment?
Yeah, I do. I'm not involved with high school education, although through the Defining Moments, that's one of its main focuses is on.
You will be.
Yeah, well, I'm more attuned to that now, with being involved with that project, because that's my sort of primary audience, as it were, or customers, or whatever you want to. I don't think quite the same on that myself personally directly. I see it bigger than that, because what I do kind of is broader. But still, I think it's going to change. Yeah, I've in a pragmatic sense of it, teaching via Zoom or teaching, like we're talking right now. I'm involved with a new course at Lana School of Public Health that's been kind of thrown together very quickly, an online course. There's a lot of grad students are kind of scrambling for course requirements because their practicums were canceled, or because that kind of thing. So someone suggested, let's do a course called Public Health Perspectives on COVID-19. And so, a bunch of faculty members kind of put the call out to different people, and I was asked or suggested I could do a historical history component, history of epidemics in Canada. So again, I was kind of constrained. I was hoping to have a full, 2-hour session or something to explore the issue and different things, but it kind of got compressed down into a half of a session. But it was a good experience to actually have a class of 42 grad students all in a Zoom call like this, and trying to figure out how to relate to that. And I was able to pre-record my presentation, so I didn't have to kind of go through it live and try to do it that way. So just physically managing that and what goes into how do you teach that way. What's happening, I think, is creating new opportunities. I'm trying to make history, I guess, more immediate in a sense. In this context, you can probably do that more easily, perhaps, than you would have otherwise, because you're kind of forced in an online environment to kind of be creative in how you present what you're saying. You can't just kind of sit there and talk for an hour or whatever. Maybe you can sometimes, but you need to mix it up a lot more than you would otherwise, I think.
Well, one of the things I was thinking when you said that you're going to be in this new course for the public health school is how the teaching of history is going to shift and change because of this moment, but also the need for history education is shifting and changing because of this moment. And that's such a key element that I heard from things that you were saying, that people are actually going to be looking for different historical perspectives to make sense of.
Well, there's a pragmatic element as opposed to just an academic interest thing. I think a little differently than, I've seen a lot of other discussions about using history in this pandemic, and we're talking about plagues and a lot of different examples for a kind of global sense, and that's all good. We're taking it very academically, which is great too. My approach is a little more pragmatic and rooted in Canada, for one thing, and actually, I very much believe in the importance of just actually telling the story, like getting what actually did happen, as opposed to trying to analyze it too much or talk about different limitations or be too critical of it. That's all has its place. But when you do that, you kind of miss the actual story, what actually happened. And in the Canadian context, some of those stories haven't really been mapped out. And my approach is to actually do that. Tell the story as best you can from primary sources. And not be afraid to miss something, or and actually do that, and give a foundation that I can pick up, or others can actually say, oh, what Chris said about this or that, you missed this or that, well, great, then they can go and explore those themes, and that's good. And so when you're dealing with a corporate setting or a professional public health setting, you have to be careful not to get too analytical and get caught up in those sort of historical issues, which are important, but be able to just get to the actual, key things. What did the polio experience tell us about COVID? How do we relate? In polio there was convalescent serum, or there was a nasal spray, or iron lungs, and there's an obvious kind of correlation between what happened with those with COVID, and also differences, and what was different and why are they different. And the variability of polio is very much an individualistic disease. No two cases are the same. COVID's turning out to be very much like that. So there's those kind of commonalities. Polio was more about kids originally, but spread and more affected adults and older kids as time went on. COVID's almost the opposite, starting with the elderly and turning out to be going the other way with more and more younger people involved. So there's a lot of those kind of commonalities that appreciating what happened in a basic sense, as opposed to getting involved with a lot of the nuances of history. That's important. And when you're dealing with people on the ground that are dealing with public health and responses, I think it's valuable. I think more so perhaps than just talking about the plague in a more esoteric sense. You know what I mean? That's all good. That's nothing wrong with that, but there's a place to actually have, good basic history based on primary materials, and I think that's what's important for high school kids, is and what this situation can bring to accessibility to primary documents, actually, letters and the kind of stuff that I work with to piece together history, and with insulin too. Insulin's a very different kind of thing than a pandemic, but we're really trying to emphasize the primary materials and have kids work with actual letters or committee meetings or lab notebooks or things like that, hospital records, and just relate to the history, relate to the documents more than if you did it in a more traditional sense. And there's an opportunity to do that, I think, with this, and tell stories. And stories is really what drives it, really, especially when you're trying to communicate history to kids and relate to it. So.
One of the things that I find so powerful about history and using primary sources is it allows us to see the variety of different experiences in the past. And I have argued, which is the basis of like both the YouTube channel and my upcoming book, and just like anytime anybody hears me at a conference, is that the more experiences we allow in our classrooms, the more we're able to transform and imagine who we are together in a community on this land called Canada or globally. And that this imagining is such a key element of transforming the world to be more equitable for so many different young people. So that's why the video series is called Imagining a New We, but that's also why I have the last question about imagining a new we itself. Do you think during this moment with being in this like immediate historical moment, thinking about different access to primary sources, do you think that we will get a chance to imagine a new we differently after this moment?
I'm concerned too that we get so wrapped up in the digital in the context of having to adapt things. I'm afraid of high school kids especially losing touch, literally touch with real archives, real documents that they actually can see, or artifacts, and being in a museum or being in an archive. And we're having to adapt to that reality, and that's understandable. But we need to think also post-pandemic or post in a way so we don't lose, figure out a way to ensure we can use the digital and digitize stuff and have it all nicely accessible. You need a sense of discipline, a sort of historical discipline, to actually get out to an archive and actually get into it, get your hands dirty and pick through things and not have everything kind of right in front of you and pre-curated. Because there's a certain element you need to be able to discover that as an historian, to actually work with the material. And so we need to be careful not to lose sight of that and get caught up in the technology, the convenience, the cult of the convenience, and the cult of convenience idea, which having things all kind of right at you. And I think a lot of high school kids are kind of subject to that. Everything has to be on their phone, and if it isn't just so, they don't care about it so much, and it's too convenient. If it's inconvenient, then they don't do it. And you need to have a certain element of inconvenience to learn, to appreciate history, especially to actually you have to go away from your desk and away from the computer, and not everything's going to be there. And to assume everything is there is a problem. So you have to make sure that's part of the teaching, is what you're seeing on your computer and digital archives might seem like a lot, but it's actually not. There's a lot more that's not digitized, may never be digitized. And also if you overly digitize and spend too much time on that, you risk losing the real stuff. You think, oh, that's all that matters, so let's just throw away all the stuff in the archives. And that's a problem, because digital is very vulnerable. There's a vulnerability inherent in all that we need to be aware of. Documenting this pandemic. One of your other talks, the archivist, one of the last ones I watched yesterday, talked about everybody's collecting material about the pandemic, and that's all good, but what's going to happen to that? A few months or a few years down the line, is that going to disappear? Who's going to take care of that? What's going to happen to the digital archives? Who's going to save that? How are you going to save it? And how are they going to be available 10, 100 years from now, right? So there's lots of those sort of questions.
one of the things for me when you said like inconvenient, I think that the convenience, I think that your capacity for what is convenient increases the more you're interested in it, right? So the ideas that you were saying earlier about history, history having a particular moment right now that allows us to be able to really want to draw on the past to make sense of what we're doing, I think will increase students' interest in exploring those other stories and recognizing that there need to be other places to do that. So do you think when they do that, they will be able to imagine a new we then?
Yeah. I mean, given the chance, I mean, we're in a new world in a sense. I mean, so you know, who knows what's going to happen? But it is a chance. I mean, these sort of situations create opportunities to try new things. So and students, high school students, are particularly good at that and creating new connections, new ideas, new ways of doing things, and that's all good. I mean, you have to kind of trust that. I mean, I can be critical of the digital world and what I was just saying, but you know, I can't control that. I can help shape it and what I do, and doing what we're doing to help people be aware of sort of limitations or the risks or the challenges of that. But in the midst of that, the new situation, new things are going to come up, and it is a chance for closer awareness or new awareness of history, maybe more than people realize. And the convenience is valuable to have stuff available more easily than there would otherwise be. So we can't be too critical of that. That's all good. We have to just be aware of how you're dealing with that, you know, as a teacher or other teachers, and how you manage and keep options open for kids as they're getting, you know, or university level people, to be wary of the convenient. I mean, that's what I'm saying. It's, you know, there's that tendency today to get caught up in that, and here and now it's a very presentist culture, you know, social media. You know, some social media services don't even have an archive. It's all now, and you know, if you don't want, hopefully you don't want to look back last week and see what you posted then. No, it doesn't matter. Well, it does matter. You know? So if you want to preserve history, you have to have an ability to preserve it in a serious way for students. So yeah, there's lots of opportunities, I think, to, you know, create something new, you know, using history as a tool to do that, and recognizing commonalities with the past, you know, relating, as I said, on a personal level with what happened in past epidemics. So when you know, if a student wants to study polio, for example, has lived through our situation today, they've got something more to work with to actually kind of relate to what happened then. You know, so there's lots of different things you can do. So.
Christopher, thank you so much for sharing your wealth of experience to this conversation. I think it's good. It's such a rich complement to all of the other talks. So I think this is a good place to say goodbye. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Yeah.
This has been really great, and we'll stay connected to, well, especially with the Defining Moments Canada project, but who knows what other ideas might percolate from this pandemic pedagogy series. So thank you again.
You're very welcome. Okay.
All right, bye.
Bye.